well, slightly an underwhelming audience for a wonderful speaker, and my dear friend Gavin, who is visiting here from Washington, and is a fantastic historian of both U.S. nuclear policy, but also U.S. monetary policy, has published wonderful books and requires really no introduction. Now is the director of the Kissinger Center for Global Affairs in Washington. Frank, thank you for coming all the way from Washington. Delighted to see you back with us. The topic of today's lecture is thinking historically. There's thinking historically, and there's something after that, right? A guide to statecraft and strategies. So I think what we should do, and we've got about an hour, if I understand correctly, we can, or maybe slightly over now, we can start by you making some remarks, and then we'll just have a broader conversations, I think, between us and the participants. Frank, thank you.
Sounds good. And thanks. 9 people here. I don't need this. Thank you for your warm introduction. It's always great to be back in Bologna. Love seeing everyone here, and I wish I could come more often. And basically what I'm going to talk about today is a book that I'm just in the process of finishing up. Almost everything that happens, as well as almost everyone who has ever lived, is forgotten. We recall and record only the tiniest fractions of the past, amounting to only a sliver of the time humans have been on the planet, and barely a whisper of the life of the earth. This act of remembering, chronicling, assessing, and trying to make sense of the past is, perhaps more than anything else, what makes us human. Why do we choose to remember what we do in the ways that we do? There are many reasons: to commemorate, celebrate, to generate identity and community, to better understand the world around us, to create meaning and purpose, to seek justice and to improve our world, and to mark and evaluate how and why things change and don't change over time. There are irresolvable debates about what kinds of marking of the past is history qua history, as opposed to tradition, myth-making, theology, propaganda, or just nostalgia. There's long been a belief, however, that the close study of the past holds vital clues to navigating the dangers and opportunities in our present and future worlds, and that excavating, evaluating, and effectively making use of those clues depends upon the quality and vigor of our historical efforts. One of the long-standing purposes of examining the past is for a self-contained political or socioeconomic group, from a tribe to a nation to an empire, to chronicle, understand, and succeed in its relations with other collective entities. And despite the power of globalization throughout history, no shared, all-encompassing world political organization has ever developed, and different polities and societies have often struggled to manage their interactions and relations successfully and safely with other groups. Sometimes these quote-unquote international relations were constructive, peaceful, and even mutually beneficial, shaped by what we might think of as statecraft. At other times, of course, these relations with outsiders were deadly and violent, driven by war and shaped by what we might think of as strategy. More often than not, statecraft and strategy were and continue to be inextricably interconnected. The stakes in understanding why war did or did not emerge, or how to prevail if it did, were enormous, remain enormous. Equally important was generating insights and lessons for how best to navigate relations with other groups to ensure survival, stability, and success. Now, this was certainly the goal of the first foundational work of modern history, Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. At least 3 things are notable, even revolutionary, about this classic. First, Thucydides set out to understand the cause and course of a decades-long war that ultimately brought ruin to his polity, the great city-state of Athens. In the process, he examined and assessed the statecraft and strategy of the major participants. Second, Thucydides strived to make his account as objective and scientific as he could, at least as he understood the term. Whether he achieved his goal, or whether any historian can accomplish this task, is of course debatable. But his purpose was not to mine and selectively choose the facts of the past to praise or demonize particular leaders, polities, divinities, or systems of governance. His aim, as difficult then as now, was to uncover the elusive truth, with the idea that such a history might prove instructive for others. Third, the Peloponnesian War crafts a historical narrative where the outcome is not predetermined or obvious from the beginning. No gods, powerful destiny, or historical fate produced an inevitable outcome. The choices made by leaders and polities in ancient Greece mattered. But there were also forces that no leader or city-state could have foreseen, let alone controlled, that also determined what happened. We often forget this, but Athens' fortunes were dictated as much by an unexpected public health crisis, a plague its citizens could do little to combat, as it was by its ineffective strategy and statecraft. For Thucydides, history was shaped by a mixture of choice and structure, linear developments, and the mysterious, unexpected, and explosive, between steadfast laws and principles and uncertain, unpredictable outcomes. History of the Peloponnesian War began a long, extraordinary practice, both by enlightened publics, individuals tasked with making collective political decisions, of exploring history to better understand international relations and construct effective statecraft and strategy to navigate a dangerous and uncertain world. The consequences of war and peace on human societies has been and remains profound, perhaps the most important variable shaping outcomes from the personal to the global. Over the past century plus, as the ferocity and lethality of war has dramatically increased, and the benefits of peace have become more salient, this desire to understand and, if possible, minimize the tragedies of war has understandably increased enormously. The invention, development, and spread of thermonuclear devices, a weapon whose mass use would cripple, if not end human civilization, makes this historical mission more pressing than ever. Now, given this legacy and the current circumstances, one might think that understanding scholarly history of statecraft and strategy was prized and influential. There are few issues of contemporary concern that do not have a deep connection to conflict and diplomacy. The world we inhabit, from profound technological developments to our systems of governance to our individual and collective identities, have been shaped by the consequences of war or the efforts to avoid it. Subjects ranging from modern medicine to art to civil rights to food and energy consumption to the sources of innovation cannot be fully understood without coming to terms with the history of war and peace. The consequences of statecraft and strategy go far beyond battlefields, the deliberations inside foreign offices, and the treaties signed at international conferences. They cast an enormous shadow, affecting every society, every nation, every individual on the planet. Yet we understand far less about these subjects than we should. These are powerful and compelling reasons to examine the past for insights and understanding about statecraft and strategy. Unfortunately, however, using history to explore questions surrounding war and peace has fallen out of fashion, at least in the academic discipline of history, and particularly in the United States. For many in the academic historical community, the study of statecraft and strategy is not a worthwhile scholarly pursuit. Peruse the declining roster of tenured historians with the largest and most esteemed history departments in major research universities around the world, and one is struck by the small number, even the absence of scholars engaged in the historical study of questions of war and peace, diplomacy, and international relations. When the subject of international relations is pursued by historians, it is often defined to exclude what most people understand as statecraft and strategy, and written in a way to be of little utility, to say nothing of interest, to decision makers or even a wider public. Academic historians, in other words, have ceded the field to understanding foreign policy and global politics to others, both within and outside the academy. This gap has, of course, been filled by other disciplines and approaches. You all know this through your curriculum: law, economics, and international relations theory that offer tools and insights that claim to be better oriented to the realities faced by decision makers. And unlike diplomats, statespeople, and strategists in the past, those charged with policy today around the world are more likely to be trained in political science, law, or public affairs and public policy, experiencing only fleeting interactions with history. The decline of historical thinking is deeply unfortunate for the academic field of history, but more important for the practice and understanding of grand strategy and foreign policy. This is especially tragic within the United States, where decision makers find themselves with enormous power, facing extraordinarily complex and consequential choices about an uncertain future, and are often desperate for the kind of guidance and wisdom that only history can provide. Now, my book makes the case for the benefits of a greater historical awareness and to provide a sense of what it is historians do and why it matters. While what is offered in the book can be applied more broadly to any issue or subject where history is engaged, my arguments will focus particular attention on how a deeper engagement with history can improve our understanding and even the practice of statecraft and strategy. Now, there are, of course, spirited and important theoretical and ideological debates about how international relations does or should work, and how various countries, including the United States, will or should behave in the world. I hold views on these subjects and these important issues, but the book does not argue on behalf of any particular perspective or school of thought of why wars happen or are avoided, what factors shape outcomes that we care about in international relations, or even what makes for effective statecraft and strategy. Nor does it offer a particular philosophy of history. Instead, the book advocates for what I call thinking historically. I also call in the book a historical sensibility, a certain way of assessing, evaluating, and trying to make sense of the world, to use a critical examination of the past to generate better understanding of our current and future challenges and circumstances. Indeed, it argues that more effectively employing historical tools can help the observer better assess and evaluate the arguments that are made about the world, both by practitioners and by other academic fields, disciplines, and schools of thought. The field of history has far more to offer to far more people, to far broader and relevant purposes than it currently does. And historians, I believe, and I know Sergey agrees with this, have a professional and even a moral obligation to help individuals and organizations in positions of responsibility, especially in matters of war and peace, even if it is primarily to hold them accountable for their choices. So that's what the book is about. Why did I write it? I'll just mention briefly why I wrote it, and then I'll talk a little bit about what's in it. There were three particular, very personal experiences that made me think about the importance of thinking historically to understanding statecraft and strategy. The first was when I was very young. I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago. And I was studying there in the mid-1980s. And I had the good fortune to become very close to and the research assistant for 2 years to someone you've all heard of, John Mearsheimer. Before John lost his mind and became completely crazy, he was an extraordinary scholar, and being his research assistant was a transformative experience for me because I got to see up close what a brilliant, hardworking, conscientious scholar did. And it was a transformative experience for me. I said, I want to be like this. But there was a less salutary side of this because I was studying political science and international relations. And at the time, the way the Cold War was taught was that it was a permanent and almost even desirable part of the international system. That the bipolar distribution of power between the Soviet Union and the United States wasn't going to change anytime soon, and that in fact, there were all sorts of benefits to it. I graduated in 1988, and then 1989 happened. And it's like that scene in The Wizard of Oz when it goes from black and white to color, right? It was a totally different world. Some of us can see, judging by hair color similar to mine, some of us remember that. And it was as if the world had transformed. And that period between 89, 90, and 91, as a young person, as I tried to understand, as all of us did, what was going on, I realized that literally nothing I learned in international relations was remotely useful. It obviously failed to predict what had happened. But again, very few people had made the prediction. And like we can talk about that a little bit if that's the correct assessment we should use for an intellectual tool. But I think even more to the point, it actually didn't provide much to actually help understand the causes of it. And it was created this crisis for me, and I decided that I wanted to pursue a PhD in history to try to understand the past, to see if the past held any clues to what had happened and any clues as to how to understand this great phenomena. So that was experience one. Experience two, I then I got a master's degree at Oxford in modern European history, and then I studied at the University of Pennsylvania. I was very fortunate to have three terrific mentors. Bruce Kuklick is an intellectual historian, deeply skeptical of this kind of project. Had sort of done one of this history blind oracles he was writing at the time I was in graduate school, looking at the history of how security studies as a subfield had developed. And when you look at academic disciplines through a historical lens, it's always interesting when you see fields that make claims towards universality, parsimony, generalization, focus on falsifiability, and all the things that we associate with social science. When you actually write their own history, you see things that you wouldn't see otherwise when you study the field, as opposed to if you study how the field emerged. So he was a great mentor. Walter McDougall wrote these beautiful, sweeping, synthetic accounts of the history of American foreign policy. And then Mark Trachtenberg, who was a scholar who took the best from international relations theory and combined it with history. And this is an approach that I've always appreciated. Ended up writing a dissertation on the history of international monetary relations, and like all PhD students, tried to get a job. No history department would have me. I've actually never had a job in a history department, despite being a historian, and I've never actually interviewed for a position in a history department. I've been at wonderful policy schools, chair in the MIT political science department, but I've never had as much as a phone interview or even an unpaid affiliation with the history department. And we can talk about it's probably more about me than the field of history, but you can see where at least some of my orientation of the discipline comes from. But I got this job in 2000 at the University of Texas at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. I actually saw Gabriel, an old student of mine in the PhD program, who now is a great teacher here, and it brought me back. But it was a time in 2000 when historians working at schools of public policy or international affairs were relatively rare, right? The people like Sergey and myself weren't at schools like SAIS or the LBJ school. There would be cases here and there, but it wasn't as widespread. And I wrestled with, what should I teach? What value could I bring to the students? They were taking classes in economics, they were taking classes in statistics, in macro and micro. They might be doing some sociology, area studies, language. What could a historian, what could I possibly bring to the table? And there was a class, a core course there called policy development. And I thought, well, I'll teach that and I'll go into the past and see how policy development works. Now, it's ironic, they hired me as a presidential historian because I found out later that in 1999, the Lyndon B. Johnson Library that holds the archives had decided to release the presidential recordings that Johnson had recorded all his phone calls. They were supposed to be released a century after his death. and the director of the library convinced Lady Bird Johnson to release them early. They emerge, they create a media sensation, and everyone is paying attention to these. And the LBJ library was managed by a foundation that also managed the LBJ school. And everyone at the LBJ school thought, we don't have anyone who can comment on these recordings, right? And so the library is getting all this attention. So they said, we got to get a presidential historian. That's not who I was, but I pretended to be one to get a job. That's what one does when one's trying to get a job. And I was hired. So I decided in this policy development course, what I would do is take advantage of the fact that right next door was this extraordinary archive where you could see history as a laboratory and how policymakers made decisions. And what I focused on were one of the things that I've long considered an irony, which was to focus on two policies the same people developed at the same time, the same people. So the first was the decision in 1964 and 1965 to escalate the American involvement in Southeast Asia. And then the second policy by the same people at the same time was the response to China's nuclear capability, nuclear test in the fall of 1964, how to construct the policy. And it was a puzzle, right? Because the decision to escalate Southeast Asia is arguably the most disastrous, catastrophic decision made by American policymakers, certainly since 1945, arguably in this whole history. There's an interesting debate. We can talk about this, about which had worse consequences, Vietnam or Iraq, but disastrous policy. The second policy, same people, laid the foundations for the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, arguably the most successful arms control treaty in history, and perhaps one of the most successful policies certainly since 1945. And this led to a couple things. You couldn't just, when you went back to look at Vietnam, and say these people were just stupid. They didn't lose 20 IQ points when they went from one meeting to another meeting, right? It highlighted the complexity and sometimes the connections policies. So that was the first puzzle. But the second puzzle was trying to learn from history. And I taught this course first in the fall of 2000 and then in the spring of 2001. And they would do simulations, they would play different roles because they would use the archives. And I looked over my notes recently preparing for this book. And from my notes from teaching this course on the Vietnam escalation, so we would do a scenario where someone would play Dean Rusk, someone would play Vice President Humphrey. Could they come up with a different decision? And I wrote, at least this will never happen again. This was obviously several months before 9/11, and I could not be more wrong. And as 2001 and 2002 and 2003 emerged, and it's something Sergey and I were talking earlier about, and as we've been thinking a lot about with the 20th anniversary of the US war in Iraq, I was stunned by the lack of historical thinking, not just, to be fair, by policymakers, but generally in American culture writ large. That one of the obvious set of historical lessons from the disastrous decision to intervene in a civil war in Southeast Asia, which had tragic consequences, that no one thought to say, as the United States was moving in Afghanistan and Iraq, was there perhaps a lesson we could learn from that disaster, which was, again, not that far in the past? And the absence of even bothering to ask that question highlighted for me how important thinking historically was, and how, for any number of reasons, some cultural, some having to do with the discipline of history, that kind of historical thinking towards policy, that muscle had atrophied. And so that was the sort of second big experience for me, to try to think about why, would his thinking historically have avoided some of the disasters in 2003 onward? It's a counterfactual. Historians don't like it. But I at least think, and this is one of the points I make in the book, that there would be better questions that would have been asked. I think the third experience was as I started teaching policy and then came to SAIS, I started thinking about these lessons and looking at the various epistemologies and pedagogies that students were exposed to. And these wonderful tools of statistics and languages and economics, international relations theory. And I had an instinct and a belief that thinking historically or historical skills were just as valuable for young people who were going to go on to make decisions. That in their career, they were going to face difficult, consequential decisions, facing complexity and radical uncertainty about the future, and that a familiarity with history would be helpful. But there was a puzzle and a problem. Everyone thinks historically, right? And it's one of those things that's very hard to define. We all use the past in order to make sense of the present and future. We just do it poorly. Now, Dick Neustadt, Ernie May had written this book called Thinking in Time, which was based on a class at Harvard in the 70s and 80s. It's now taught by Fred Logevall, but it was generally around this same principle that they like to compare it to sex education for teenagers. Teenagers who are going to have sex, you should at least teach them how to do it safely and perhaps even enjoy it. And it was the same with history, that everyone was going to think historically that you should at least teach people how to do it better. But there's some problems with this. And the Thinking in Time book has many, many qualities, great qualities, but there's some problems with it. One of the problems with history, unlike other academic disciplines, is that there's no agreed upon epistemology or methodology. Indeed, and I talk about this a bit in the book, when I was an undergraduate in the University of Chicago, I was a political science major, but if you wanted to major in history, Chicago had 4 divisions: physical sciences, biological sciences, humanities, and social sciences. And every discipline fit clearly in one of those. But if you wanted to major in history, you could choose to do it in the social sciences or in the humanities. The only difference was if you took it in the social sciences, you dropped one of your language and took a stats class. But what that revealed is that history doesn't know if it's a humanities or a social sciences. There's a very kind of basic core issue of epistemology. And say someone like Jacques Barzun, who's was one of our greatest cultural historians, the idea that you could think about using history instrumentally and be it as a social science was nonsense. That thinking historically was more like poetry, more like music, was more like an affinity towards culture. Whereas obviously Marxism is a school of historical thought that is based on a notion of the scientific unfolding of the past into the present and the future. But you could not get 2 historians together to agree on a basic question of philosophy of history. And this is a challenge, right? If you decide to become a lawyer, a neurosurgeon, or an architect, there is an agreed upon pedagogy, an agreed upon curriculum about what you need to do to become an expert. There's also results, like if you fake it in neurosurgery and people die, people realize it. If you're a bad architect and your buildings collapse, there are judgments. It's not that way in history. There's not an agreed upon, certainly within the discipline of history, of what counts for great history and what doesn't. Indeed, when you think about it, some of the most popular historians in the world are not academically trained historians. If you were to look at what are the most influential, popular history books read not just by the public, but also by policymakers, they're often written by non-academic historians. And that struck me as a problem. And my goal was certainly not to write the definitive philosophy of history. I wasn't going to try to be Hegel in this, but I thought that at the very least, identifying this as a problem and recognizing the problem, and actually to see that within that diversity of epistemological and pedagogical views and methodological views, there were actually some benefits. That thinking historically, one of its best attributes allows you to hold a lot of ideas in your head, many of which are in tension and even contradict each other. And so that's one thing that I thought I needed to sort of think through, and certainly not resolve, because by nature, it's not resolvable. Related to this was, I alluded to in my opening comments, and it's something that I've thought about quite a bit, where the traditional academic discipline of history itself has, for its own reasons, abandoned the study of statecraft and strategy. There is, for political reasons, a deep discomfort with issues of power or being associated with power, a issue and concern that, say, political scientists or economists rarely have. And there's another phenomenon that's happened that I think has been salutary, and you can see this here at SAIS, and it was something when I was at University of Texas that we did a lot to help with, is that many schools of public affairs, international policy, even business schools started recognizing, well, we don't know what history is, but it seems like a good idea to have some historians around. And so arguably, I would say SAIS has perhaps one of the most impressive collection of diplomatic, military, and international historians in the world. We've got the Sergey and myself and Hal and Mary Serrati at the Kissinger Center, Mark Gilbert here in Bologna, which is a pretty impressive, and others who are historian adjacent, like Elliot. And so I started thinking that both that I should chart out why this was a good thing and start thinking about what would be a path forward in creating, if not an epistemology, at least a pedagogy, how we should think about the case to be made to young people at a place like SAIS who are going to go off and be important decision makers, and to say, here are the kind of ways of thinking that we believe could be helpful and supplement the other parts of your curriculum, and not just learning stories about the past, not just taking historical analogies from the past, but the book goes through, there's two things, and maybe we can talk about it in Q&A, that I think are particularly interesting about it. One is, in the longest chapter, I imagine a policymaker, and she is asked by her principal or president or prime minister to think about a speech where the current international system looks as if we have a new Cold War, whether it's a competition and rivalry with Russia or China, but making all sorts of comparisons to the Cold War, and to ask, how should she think about what lessons there were from the Cold War? And in that chapter, I sort of break down the many different ways you can look at and understand the Cold War by asking 5 basic questions that we all think we know the answer to, but no one agrees upon. When it began, how and why it ended, what caused it, how important policy was, what other powerful historical events were going on, whether it was decolonization or European integration and union, or the rise of Arab nationalism and Islamism, or globalization, or the rights revolution and identity revolution, or the nuclear revolution, and to think about all of these things and to make sense of it. And one of the challenges in the book, and one of the challenges as a historian, is that we're really good at complicating things. So this policymaker says, all right, this is great, but I don't have time for a PhD seminar on why everything I thought I knew about the Cold War actually is more complicated, right? And so in the 4th chapter, what I develop is something that I call the history checklist. And this is kind of playing on Atul Gawande is a great, he's a great emergency room physician who's on TV a lot. And he developed this idea about checklists in emergency rooms. And this was an idea that came about in the 1930s when, at the time, it was the US Army was testing various aircraft. preparing for World War II. And the more sophisticated ones kept crashing. And one of the things they realized was that if you came up with a checklist of basic procedures that you follow and make sure you check them off, you reduce the amount of accidents enormously. Turns out you do the same thing in emergency rooms, and it's often basic things that we forget to do. And so I provide a similar checklist for, and I was telling Sergey, most checklists are 3 or 5 or 10. I made mine 11 on purpose because historians don't want to ever make things too simple, right? So 11 is a weird number, and it's 11 questions that any policymaker should ask before making a decision, and then a whole series of concepts that are surrounding it. Anyway, that's the idea behind the book. That's the general overview. All sorts of other things that I could talk about, but probably better to turn it over to you and the audience and conversation.
Great. Thank you, Frank. Thank you for this, the really insightful comments. As you were speaking, I was thinking about my own also growth in professional terms as a historian, and how much less certain I have become over the years about anything. When I started my career, you talked about your career and where you started. When I started my career, everything seemed so simple. You just find some documents and you say, hey, here's what happened. You tell a story on the basis of, some documents, and you say, hey, this is history. And then after passage of years, I don't know what happened. Why is it that I have become so confused by stuff? Now everything seems so complicated, and you read a document, you're no longer sure what it means, you're no longer sure what it says, and you cannot really understand fundamentally, you cannot be sure of what the people who you describe historically, what those people were actually thinking. You make a guess about what they were thinking, and you're always wondering whether this guess that you're making about their own thinking is actually on the basis of the evidence, or is it on the basis of your own biases and attributes, and then you attribute to that particular, historical actor. So it becomes very difficult. I guess it's difficult to be a mature historian, is what I'm trying to say. It's difficult to come up with any lessons from the past. And I was struck by what you said about the Cold War just now, that the Cold War, people tend to assume that there are certain lessons of the Cold War, but when you start digging into it, then you realize that actually there aren't really any clear-cut lessons of the Cold War, because anything you take in the Cold War, or for this matter, any other historical period or debate, there are different views on what actually happened there, and yet the general public seems to think that there are lessons, and they know. Not only do they think that there are certain historical lessons, they demand, not just policymakers, but the public demand the lessons, and they apply lessons generously without actually understanding the lessons are not even clear-cut at all. Look at any contemporary debate. How many times have we heard some kind of, invocation of Munich, or something like that? Anytime I hear about Munich, I just roll my eyes. I think, oh my God, not Munich again, not Hitler again. Here comes Hitler again. That is really a difficult thing to admit for a historian, that there are actually no clear-cut lessons from the past.
Want me to respond?
Yeah, let's have a more of a conversation. I was leading up to something, but feel free.
Ahead.
No, go ahead.
So you highlighted a very, very, very important point, which is for our students and our colleagues, or imagine you have a possibility of briefing a principal for 15 minutes. One of the reasons, one of the things I learned from working with John Mearsheimer is that if you got 15 minutes, you don't hesitate, you don't express any uncertainty.
You don't do what I just did.
Right, right. And so here's the dilemma. So there's a couple dilemmas. One is, we all know Isaiah Berlin, riffing off of Tolstoy, riffing off the ancient Greeks, talked about thinkers being either hedgehogs or foxes. And foxes are those who believe the world's complicated. There's no overarching explanation for things. Everything is circumstance and context. Hedgehogs believe the world is shaped by one overarching principle, algorithm, theory, or rule. And to be fair, there's plenty of historians that were hedgehogs, right? I mean, Marx, Hegel were certainly hedgehogs. And, Phil Tetlock did this great study about expert political judgment 15 or 20 years ago, where he showed that for any number of reasons, the experts we are likely to turn to, either for being advisors or showing up on television or reading their work, are hedgehogs. Yet their predictions are more incorrect than monkeys throwing darts at a dartboard. And so you think everyone here, and I actually think these are fine pieces for teaching purposes, but we've all read Sam Huntington, Frank Fukuyama, Mearsheimer's Why We'll Miss the Cold War. And what we like about them is that they're bold, certain explanations of a complex, chaotic world. And then the historians show up and say, this is wrong, that is wrong, you got this wrong. But for our students, they're thinking, I've got that 15 minutes. And by the way, if you're that policymaker, you need to choose. To not choose is to choose. And the reason I was opening up the manuscript, I'd forgotten what I'd actually called it, but there's this phrase I use called historical vertigo, where you're so overwhelmed by context, circumstances, perspective, varying time horizons, that you're frozen. You can't make a decision. And that's the worst thing for a policymaker. And one of the best lines, one of the great lines Kissinger had, and it's in the sort of the Daedalus piece from '67, where he says, one of the great ironies of policy is the time at which we can make the greatest difference is when we have the least knowledge. And as we gain more and more knowledge, the room for change decreases. So in 1936, we could have stopped Hitler. But though he looked bad, we weren't 100% sure where Hitler was going. By 1940, we knew, but we had less room to maneuver. And so one of the things that policy is about, and I try to talk about this in the book, where a historical sensibility can help you, is to try to balance between that profound sense of uncertainty with the need to act, and to not fall prey, as historians often do, to that sense of vertigo where it's overwhelming. There's another thing, and I don't talk about this in this book because it's for the next book that Dean and I are writing based on a class that we've been teaching for years for the Kissinger seminar, but we talked before then. And it's the Steinberg armadillo rule that when confronted with extremes, we often take the middle policy, and history often leads you to that. And Jim likes to say the only thing in the middle of the road is a dead armadillo. It's a very Texas statement, meaning that just because one of the things in policy that we're inclined to do when we think historically is take the middle path. The middle path can often be the worst path. You can think of any number, say Libya in 2011. You do nothing, you do everything, instead you do something in the middle. And oftentimes policy disasters are the moderate course. So all of this is a way of saying that it is incumbent upon any historian who wants to teach future decision makers to be upfront about the fact that, first of all, history will complicate things, and it has the potential to create this vertigo and freeze you from acting, which is the last thing any decision maker makes. So you need to find a way to climb out of that. And I talk about that in the book.
Of course, historians, if you're a good historian, presumably you will advocate middle of the road.
Right, which can often be the wrong policy choice.
Yeah.
And so there's another part of this too. So one of the forget which number question I call it. All right, question 8, was this inevitable? Outcome bias. I call this the third Balkan War dilemma, which is if you're in July 1914 and we look back on it in this major crisis and say this changed the world, right? This was unbelievably consequential. At the time, there were many people in European capitals that said we had gone through 2 Balkan crises and they did not result in general war. We might be able to navigate this, right? There are ways, whether you believe that or not, that's at least, it's important to say we often assess policies ex post by whether they work or not, which is a fine standard, but one of the things that a historical sensibility provides you is most issues in statecraft and strategy, as Kissinger said, are 51-49 questions, meaning you could do everything right and things could work out wrong. What history should show you how to do is to think ex ante, radical uncertainty of the future. You have no idea how things are going to turn out. This is what I was saying to Bart last night about even if everything had gone well in the US war in Iraq, it still would have been a bad idea. Still would have been terrible. That it wasn't necessarily how it turned out that was the problem. And this is kind of hard to get around, but it's to truly think historically, when you go to the past, you take actors seriously in their own terms. And the most important thing about people in the past is that they didn't know what the future held. So when we go back to the past, we've got to go back and say, well, they didn't know what was going to happen. That is what is similar with policymakers. They don't know what the future holds. And so, and we know for any number of reasons that our linear predictive models do a very, very terrible job of capturing complex political, social, and cultural phenomena. So it's to acknowledge everything you said. I agree with you. I, as LBJ used to say, I can argue it flat around. But what I'm trying to do is to say, if we are going to be part of the world of helping train and teach future decision makers, we need to recognize how to help them get out of that historical vertigo, to be able to make choices, the best choices they can, to recognize that many of those choices are going to turn out poorly, right? One of the other things I talk about is that a historical sensibility allows you to recognize when things are going bad more quickly. A lot of times good policymaking is not about the initial choice. It's about recognizing, okay, my first choice was wrong, instead of, kind of a prospect theory, doubling down on it. How do I cut my losses and get out? Anyway, I don't know if that answers any of your concern.
No, sure. And and just sort of to continue that thought about, it's interesting you mentioned Mark Trachtenberg, because in general you don't, historians do not seem to draw on parallel fields, and Mark does it extremely well by having this grounding in IR theory. Not like IR theories necessarily always draw on history, but this conversation back and forth is extremely important. What I have found as well in my own approach to history, certainly in recent years, is how much a knowledge of psychology really helps to try to make sense of uncertainties, to try to make sense of how decisions are made. So now I approach historical events with that, baggage, as it were, of at least some knowledge of psychology. And it's almost like you, as from a historian, become almost like a psychiatrist. You try to understand how those people are making.
One of the things that historians do very poorly, and this is another thing we need to do better, our social science friends who will say, okay, when you tell a story about the past, why are you telling this story? Why are you focusing on this particular actor? And what is your theory of causality? And so any decision to go in the past and reconstruct it, how you reconstruct it, what you choose to study, and how you tell the story.
Do we have a theory of causality as historians?
So one of the things I talk about in the book is that
there's a lot of reasons. I don't talk about why I think this is, but historians are deeply uncomfortable about being explicit about their theories of agency and causality.
That's right. We just like multi-causality. That's what
Right,
we call
which
it.
is kind of a BS answer.
Yeah.
So, if
We're on the
you-
same page.
If you tell a story about the end of the Cold War, as our friend Vlad Zubak does, that focuses on Gorbachev's decision making. So one of the things I talk about, even for all of my giving a hard time with international relations theory, Kenneth Walton, his classic Man, the State, and War, identifies three levels upon which three images of which you look at how the world works: individuals, state or regime, or the international system. Historians do this too. If you're from the Annales School, the great Braudel book on the history of the Mediterranean during the age of Philip II never talks about Philip II. It talks about mountains, sea, and agriculture and climate. I can tell you a story of the origins of the First World War that has nothing to do with political choices, but has to do with demography. Right? What's demography? It's a structural force, right? Or I can do a history of the First World War that has to do with the 6 weeks between late June and early August when the war happens. I can write a history of the First World War that starts in 1903 with the sort of, that's the way Christopher Clark does with the coup in Serbia. The point is that how you decide to tell the story has within it your theory of agency and causality.
But you're just not explicit.
We're not explicit about it, which is why students will say, well, this is a great story, but what can I take away from it? Our social science colleagues will say, well, I don't understand what is, and historians will say, well, every story is individual and unique, and that's fine, but we all have heuristics and conceptual models, and we need to be explicit about it. And I don't lay out any particular one. It's just for a historian to say, if I am taking the time to study this issue in the past and studying it over this time period, and focusing on these actors and have this idea for why A went to B to C, this is how I believe the world works. And that should inform how I go about making decisions.
So you want to be explicit about it, in other
Yes.
words.
Or at least acknowledge the fact that sometimes our biases about agency and causality affect how we talk about the past.
Yeah.
And at least acknowledging it. And it doesn't mean you have to be wedded. I am someone who you can imagine in different circumstances where who the leader is matters enormously, right? You can imagine circumstances where what the regime does and its circumstances matter enormously, just like you can matter the state of the international system matters enormously. And you don't want to take the historian's answer and says, well, it's all of them or none of them, right? You want to think carefully about what matters, why, and when. And there's one section of the book where I talk about the 1970s, and I talk about you could make a powerful case that for outcomes for the United States, in the middle of the 1970s, the United States looked like it's in permanent decline. And if the Soviet Union is going to pass it over, and there's a sense of the United States is doing nothing wrong. And then there's this kind of rebirth of American power. This is my California dreaming story. And you say, where does that rebirth of American power come? It comes from a variety of technological, cultural, socioeconomic events in California have nothing to do with Washington, D.C. Everything, and I talk about Silicon Valley, not just Apple Computer, but also how things are financed. Talk about Harvey Milk and the identity revolution, gay rights revolution in San Francisco, shipping containers in Long Beach, even, Boogie Nights and sort of the rise of how people think about human sexuality, that the modern porn industry is invented in San Fernando Valley in the 1970s. Everything from fruit, Chez Panisse to, Napa Valley and the great wine tasting test, right? And so some of this is being a little bit whimsical, but the argument I make is that how we live today, how we think about identity, what technologies we have, how we think about our individual relations to other individuals in the collective went through a revolutionary change in the 1970s. The source of it were events that are quite mysterious, but could be identified in California, had literally nothing to do with policy. So if you want to talk about Levi's, Apple computer, or iPhones, the identity revolution, modern finance, you name it. Now, again,
I worry about it, is a few years from now, people will forget about the Cold War and just think about Apple computers.
But the question is what was more important? You can tell a history where the end of the Cold War basically had more to do with this, the development of this.
Oh,
than
sure.
had anything to do with
Oh, sure.
Now, you could say that's wrong. The point being that historians expand the ambit, leave you really confused and uncertain. But then, and we're good at that, that's the historical vertigo. But then, for the purposes if we're going to be teaching students at SAIS, we then have to zoom back in and figure out, okay, how do you then make a decision?
What's important? Let's open it for questions. Do we have questions here? We've got Sean. We've also have a question from Mark Gilbert online. So let's go with Sean first.
Okay. First of all, thanks again for coming. Dr. Gavin, it was a really interesting speech, and it's kind of tough to pick one question because every time you say a little more, I think about something else. So I hope this question makes sense, but I had the thought that being a nuclear historian would be sort of a paradox not that long ago, because there just wasn't that much history to study. It's a pretty novel event in terms of technology and power for people to have. And so I wonder about how you think historically about things that don't really have a history. And so I'm wondering about today, the best analog I've heard for how to draft policy for artificial intelligence is nuclear arms treaties, because it's sort of a thing where the potential consequences are difficult to grapple with, and it's something that's hard to undo. So I guess if I have a question, it's how would you approach something like artificial intelligence, or something that it's difficult to think historically about without there being a history to it?
Those are great questions, and you actually got to question 10 and 11 in my book. What didn't happen, and I call that unhistory and selection effects. And then 11 is this unprecedented historical myopia. And on the what didn't happen, I mean, I talk about this in the last book, the last nuclear book I wrote, where as a historian, you're absolutely right. 99% of what we study when we look at nuclear weapons is why something didn't happen, the thermonuclear war. And that's really what we care about. Why has there been no thermonuclear war? And how do we keep that streak going? And of course, historians can't agree on an event that actually did happen, the First World War. How could you possibly come up with an explanation for something that didn't happen? And one of the things that emerged in the nuclear community, and I talked about this a little bit in my last book, is that there's not a lot of reward either in the academy, policy world, or general culture for uncertainty, humility, epistemological modesty. This gets to the hedgehog thing, right? So I have another paper, basically, which is what everything Thomas Schelling was wrong about, which you can imagine how that's gone over with the nuclear community, right? He's the god of, and he's someone who, he's very powerful, brilliant, parsimonious explanations that were highly contradictory and actually deeply problematic from a historical perspective. I've also been involved in the historical or in the nuclear studies community, of which you have a lot of political scientists doing quantitative studies. There's a lot of quantitative work on it. And when I first encountered it, I said, well, the ends are 9, 2, and 0. How can you do a decent regression when the n is, and so people develop a lot of proxies for it. We've seen it in the last year, and I could talk about that a little bit. The amount of discourse on what role nuclear weapons play in the Russia-Ukraine situation, how the U.S. is responding, how serious or not serious to take Putin's threats, how to think about deterrence.
there is a very intense and very shout-like online debate about this. And I, who have studied this, can't tell you and have changed my mind a lot and think only that everyone who tells you they think they know what it is don't know what they're thinking about, because it's a really difficult problem. Because as you said, what we really want to know, deterrence is all about why something doesn't happen. And you could make an argument that nuclear deterrence prevented World War III. I could also make an argument, and I actually lean this way, that in a world without nuclear weapons, not only would the Soviets not have taken over Western Europe, you might not have had as many dangerous problems. Like that the Soviets obviously don't care about Cuba unless they want to put medium range missiles in Cuba. Who the hell cares about Cuba? Nor does the US go to great lengths to try to defend a city, Berlin, 100 miles in enemy territory in a world that just has conventional weapons, because they couldn't do it, right? So the two great flashpoints of the Cold War are all about nuclear weapons existing. But again, I can't answer that. You could make arguments that norms, interdependence, the declining utility of war and conquest, the fact that the Soviets didn't want to go, any number of arguments, right? You can't prove it. That is not to say at some point when you're making a policy decision, you do have to make a bet. You do have to take a stake. You do have to, if you're thinking about, if you're a US policymaker in the Pentagon right now, and you're thinking about what should I do in terms of aiding Ukraine, you're thinking about the question of nuclear escalation and deterrence all the time. And you're constantly updating it. And it'll be very interesting to see, because actually the people making this, people like Colin Call and Vipin Narang and people like that, are actually security studies people trained in this shelling and stuff. It'll be very interesting to see how much, as they've thought about and updated, this has affected how they think about things. So your first point is a really good one, that we sometimes need to think historically about things that didn't happen. This leads to the second point about AI. There are times when new phenomena emerge and that history doesn't provide guidance. Historians aren't supposed to tell you that. Nuclear weapons were one of them, right? Early in the nuclear age, people looked at other historical examples to try to make sense of it, but it turns out nuclear weapons are actually unique in terms of their, not just their destructive power, but the ability to deliver them at speed anywhere in the world, eliminating time and geography. So you've got not just the enormous catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons, it's the fact that geography is eliminated and time is eliminated. And there's no historical precedent for that. So there's this phrase I call historical myopia. Early in the nuclear age, people engaged what was called conventionalization. They looked and tried to say, well, is there something about naval arms races, or something about the Gatling gun, or something about cannon fortifications that can tell us about nuclear weapons? And actually, there was very little. This is a question one would want to ask about artificial intelligence. Does it have a parallel, a useful historical parallel, or is it a novel phenomenon where actually making historical analogies is unprofitable? I actually don't know enough about artificial intelligence to answer that question, though my instinct and what little I know tells me that the nuclear analogy is actually not very helpful at all, and perhaps misleading. So it's a good question. And again, what I try to do is just to ask the question, like, one question you should ask of anything is what didn't happen. When you're looking at the world, our bias is obviously to what did happen, but there's a world of all sorts of possible outcomes that didn't happen. To ask, what would the world have looked like if those things had happened? And then to ask, is this thing that we really care about, does it have a strong, powerful historical parallel that provides us insight? Or actually, is the past more likely to be misleading? We just have to say, you know what, this is novel and new. Which again, historians don't like doing, but is an important part of thinking historically.
And there's, of course, a very interesting book that Kissinger co-authored with Eric Schmidt and what's the MIT colleague?
Or something like that. He's the
something.
chair of the computer science.
Yes, yes, where we
He's a poor guy, nobody ever remembers his name.
Well, because it's a difficult name, you know.
Well, and it's because it's Eric Schmidt, Henry Kissinger, and that other guy.
But I mean, they do try to tackle tackle this question of AI and brand strategy. I'm not sure how successfully. I mean, part of the problem with, if you compare, if you go back to the 50s when Kissinger wrote his nuclear weapons and U.S. foreign policy, at least you had a kind of a, here's the bomb, here's what it does. With AI, the problem is we don't know what it does. We don't know what it is. It's, beyond like ChatGPT that everybody knows that you can find, ask funny questions of. And that is the problem. When you don't know what you're dealing with, how can you write about it? And that's, that I, happen to agree with you entirely on how difficult those parallels are, as much as Kissinger tried to make them.
Jim and I have a debate about this because he's on Kissinger's side, and I said the two things AI can't do is it can't do causal identification, right? It can come up with it can't explain why something is, and it can't do theology, it can't do meaning or purpose, right? And so I have a bit in book about, we in our modern age don't like to talk about teleology, but all history, hopefully this isn't all pointless, right? So there's a meaning and purpose to actions.
So you're Hegelian enough.
Well, a light Hegelian. I mean, I think otherwise to not be is to be nihilist, right? So, but I don't, artificial intelligence can't do that because you're just basically synthesizing. You're not generating teleological sort of, but again, I haven't really thought about it very deeply.
Well, we've got a bunch of questions also online. We've got a couple of colleagues who are asking questions, and maybe let me turn to Mark's question first. It's a fairly long question. It's about causation. Policymakers need to understand why specific events are happening in their full complexity. One can, for instance, come up with general theories of why wars break out between great powers, but that doesn't help policymakers understand the given conflict. Learning how to, quote unquote, think historically, i.e. the art of multiplying explanatory variables, is useful for this reason. I know this is pure John Lewis Gaddis, but I think he's right. More like a comment.
Yeah, no, I think that one of the skills that I talk about for students to learn is that there's this constant interaction between the macro and the micro, right? So when you are a decision maker and you're facing particular contexts and circumstances and issues, and you're making those decisions, and it's very, historians and historical work can be very useful. Phil Zelikow is very good at this, looking at, say, 1898 and why the United States, the Philippine scenario emerged, right? And he does a micro history of looking at what decisions and what options were there. At the same time, you have to understand the macro, like what are the larger systemic, sociocultural, technological issues, and you have to figure out how to interact between them. And then I would say, again, even though I was somewhat dismissive of those theories, as I said earlier, we all have theories and heuristics about how the world works, and we want to identify them. And again, Trachtenberg was someone who believed that ultimately a kind of a small r realist view about power mattering was an important way of thinking about how the decision space was shaped, right? So one of the things we all know, that many of the circumstances that we are left with when we make decisions, let's say a random number of 95%, are set. Can't alter them. But that still leaves you that 5% where you do choose and have to choose, and that can have an impact, and that 5% can actually have explosive, punctuated equaling type of effects. And so one of the great challenges, and historians do this in their work, but they are not explicit about why and how they do it. How they go between the macro and micro, how they go between the deductive and the inductive, how they actually think about agency and causality. And I think they have an obligation to lay out how students should think about those questions, because that social science is all about agency and causality, and it's why it's so powerful and helpful a tool.
But it's important then for historians to be aware
Yes.
of their own thinking. And this is something that is not consciously really taught to
No.
historians. I for example, now I'm aware that my background, I bring my biases and my background into my historical scholarship. And if I were to, I project, in other words, I interpret history through the lens of my own experience, and my history that I write, then it becomes a history that is filtered through the lens of my own experience. And then if I then use that history to make less, or to draw policymakers' attention to, to something, what I'm really doing is I'm asking policymakers to take into account my background and my experience, because this is the kind of history that I present to them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a.
Well, and I would say there are two things, because historians don't have explicit conversations about this, they get tied up. And there are two questions that have roiled the history field that highlight this. One is, I don't know if anyone has seen this debate about presentism. The head of the American Historical Association complained that history was too focused in its historical efforts on things that mattered now.
Are you talking about the 1619 thing?
Not that this is more the James Sweet is the president of the American Historical Association. He mentioned 1619, and the problem is, and historians don't like to admit this, but remember what I said in the beginning, past is infinite, right? The overwhelming majority of us forgot. Why do we choose to remember what we do? We don't like to say this, but it's because it's what we care about today. A.H. Carr was quite explicit about this. Like, we go to the past because we are seeking answers for today and the future. Historians hate to acknowledge that, because even someone like Michael Howard in his Lessons of History says any study of the past is as equal to any other study of the past. And that's kind of the official mantra of history. That's nonsense, right? Like, that's like, you don't.
That was clearly better than others.
More important, or even without making a judgment, the historian has to say, why is it that I'm spending my life studying this particular issue? One of the great ironies is I've spent my life studying nuclear weapons. I don't think it really takes a lot to explain why that should matter, right? Although the history profession has decided it doesn't matter. And it's kind of interesting, right? You have studied the Cold War and why the Soviet Union behaved the way it did, and why Russia and China had the relations they did, and also why nuclear weapons matter and shape world politics.
Nobody cares about this.
Well, but you can see, so that's point one. Historians are uncomfortable with the fact that in some sense, all history is contemporary history. And we could talk a little bit about that. The second, which is really difficult, is normative judgment. This gets to the 1619 thing. We don't, so social scientists believe that you need to study phenomena at a kind of Archimedean point without putting in your own particular moral thoughts or preferences. Now, they don't do that. I used to have this argument with Bob Jervis, where I'd say that defensive realism was a response to American policy during Vietnam. It was clearly a normative thing, but clothed in social science. But historians wrestle with, is it just the facts, or are we uncovering the past for certain purposes? And there's a tension there. I just said we only care about things in the past that matter to us today. On the other hand, we do and should strive for that elusive objectivity, which we understand can't be achieved. So the 1619 project is a perfect example. I'm very glad it was there, because one, it provided a new perspective. Two, it generated enormous debate. There's historians, this gets to my earlier point that historians don't necessarily solve for X, right? That we believe in constantly revising and revision, and that's healthy. I used to have this belief that if you wanted to judge the civic health of any nation, more than any kind of democratic governance corruption standard, you should ask, do they encourage historical revisionism? Are you allowed to look at the past and challenge long-held beliefs, right? And there's certain, Israel does better than this. Japan, not so much, right? Even though, in terms of democracy, Japan might be a more liberal open one. The Germans got around to getting good at this after not being very good at this. Russia, not so much, right?
Oh, wow.
France is an interesting mix. I don't know how Italy thinks about it as much, but it's an interesting question, right? So, my view is instead of ignoring these questions, recognizing them and bringing them out to the surface and talking about them.
All right, let's further open the floor. Do we have questions here? Okay, well, lots of questions. We're also running out of
I'll
time.
be
I'm
quicker.
really a bad
I'll be quicker.
moderator.
I'm a
frankly.
bad answer. I'll be quicker. I'm sorry. And I have nowhere to go.
Thank you, Professor Gavin, for this very interesting discussion. My name is Arthur Appleton. I teach trade law here. So I'm one of these people that only has a glimmer of history from page 1 of your speech. But my question really is a question of practicality. Thinking historically, I think you're right. I think history is extremely important. But I'm wondering if the title of the book is a guide to historical statecraft and strategy, or whether there is a predictive element, which I guess is anathema to most historians. Because from my perspective, the predictive part becomes extremely important. That's why the question on new technology was so interesting, because it makes history very, very difficult when you have a new and disruptive technology. Thank you.
Great question. And immediately when I thought as someone who studies law, I think about the example in the US of the development of tort law, which comes out of a complete historical experience in the late 19th century of industrial accidents and trolley cars falling or steamboats blowing up all over the place, and other countries wanting to regulate it in the US because of its own political history, developing tort law. So, and this is not a history you get when you go to law school necessarily. Like
Public international law the same way.
Yeah. Right. So the predictive thing is interesting because the whole reason we seek knowledge, or one of the reasons we seek knowledge, one of the most important, is to try to navigate the present and the future, which is essentially predictive. We also know we do it really poorly. What does one do about that? One of the interesting experiences that I've had engaging with a policy experience, particularly the intelligence community, is their use of scenario exercises. And what's interesting about scenario exercises is they don't aim to make point predictions, but to identify underlying trends. And they think of causality often in ways historians do. One of the problems with a lot of predictive models is they're kind of very linear. And we all know that this, to my 1989 example, I have one of my questions is, are things changing rapidly? Punctuated equilibrium, right? Like a lot of times nothing changes. What is it that Lenin says? Some years nothing happens, and some decades happen. And an understanding of history should generate some sensitivity to that kind of dynamic punctuated equilibrium when things are kind of rapidly changing. So I will say, and I've got to think about this as a historian, the history books that I can think of, Gaddis wrote the long piece in 1989 and basically said the Cold War was a great thing. It was going to continue forever. And Paul Kennedy in 1986, when he was doing the rise and fall of great powers, everyone remembers talking about the Soviet Union, but he also said the United States was also going to decline, if not sort of. So, and Ernie May in The Lessons of the Past, written in 1973, said the only prediction he would make is that the Cold War tensions would lessen, not increase, right? And 5 years later, he was wrong about this. So I think the best one can do is understand the necessity and need and inclination to try to figure out what the future holds, without being attached to particular point predictions, being willing, again, this is what social scientists do, it's the Bayesian updating that we all sort of have to go through as new information comes about. And my argument is that a sensitivity to history allows you to do that to recognize when your predictions are weaker and need to be abandoned. It's not a particularly satisfying answer to an excellent question.
We have an interesting question online here.
I feel like the audience, those who came in person should be rewarded.
Okay, so
And we can.
all right. Yeah, we've got Hunt.
My name is Hans Maul, and I teach a class here this term on scenario building.
Oh, wonderful. Great. I love
So,
scenarios.
I have some background in history also through my academic training, but basically I'm a political scientist. One of the things I learned from your very interesting presentation, your discussion up there about biases is, it seems to me that when we talk about thinking historically, we usually have a bias towards substance. In other words, we assume what we can learn from history is how to pursue good policies. And that seems to me a very problematic assumption, essentially for two reasons. One reason is there is no logical connection between a good policy and a good outcome. That's obvious,
Yeah.
it seems to me. Good policies can fail. Bad policies can succeed. That seems obvious, right? But the second reason is the idea you mentioned there, and I must say my favorite historian on that is Stephen Morris and his book about why the West rules the world for now. And there's this fantastic graph in there. He calculates an indicator for social capabilities and does a very long-term analysis of social capabilities in our societies. And that graph is essentially a right angle. It goes like this. In other words, you have a dramatic change in what he calls social capability in a very short period of time. And that, of course, raises the question, which you alluded to several times, is history today, is there more new than there is old? And that sort of the question about the context is, of course, also very important in terms of drawing lessons from history in terms of substance. But I think there is probably more to be learned from history in terms of process rather than in terms of substance. How are decisions made rather than what decisions are taken? And I wonder how you think about this. Thank you.
That's a great point. And I'm glad, it's wonderful you're teaching scenarios, because I think your point that there's no logical connection to between good policy and process is absolutely true, but is not the way most people study and think about it, right? They assess policy on the basis of outcomes. So that insight is incredibly important, what I agree with. One of the things that your comment made me think about is there is a category, I think it's an actual question I have in here, which is, maybe it's under the punctuated equilibrium, where I talk about velocity of history and how, like, it's very, I would love to understand how, there's another category I use, called unspoken assumptions, right? The things that are so obvious they need to be said, but are mentalities that shape how you make decisions. And I've been thinking a lot about this in terms of the war in Iraq. You think about, you're my age, born in 1965, and you've lived in Beijing. And there's been more rapid historical change than anywhere else in any time in history. Just unspeakable, unfathomable amounts of change. And how that affects your understanding of the historical process, and that how that then affects your understanding of the policy process. It's a great question. I don't even really know how to get into it, but I would imagine if you were me in Beijing and everything you had witnessed in your sentient life from like 1970 to the present would make you think that history operated under this incredibly rapid, dynamic, that would be one thing you would think. And then you would probably develop certain ideas about policy and the policy process that brought that about, that might be at odds with how 57-year-old Frank would be thinking about it in Tokyo, or thinking about nearby in Tokyo, or in Melbourne, or here in Bologna. So, that sort of philosophy of history that we all have, this great piece by Andrew Earhart about every man a philosopher of history, I think, to your point, is that we're all in a particular environment where, based on how rapidly or not rapidly we've seen things change and why we believe things change, shape how we think what the process should be to bring about change. There's an inherent bias in policy to, you want outcome A, you use, or you have problem A, you use treatment B to get outcome C, a very simplistic idea. And that's sort of actually the whole premise of schools like this, which has its own particular history. And one of the things that, as a historian, you can step back and say, well, actually, outcome A may have emerged through reasons that have nothing to do with policy, or you may have generated unintended consequences through your particular policy choice. One of the things I like about the scenario process so much is that capturing what the underlying trends are that are shaping the world you're in, which then gives you a sense for, okay, to me, one of the most underappreciated variables in the study of international relations is demographics, right? Why people, how long they live, who they choose to live with, how many children they choose to have, all of those sort of things that go into that. But it's something that we're very rarely fully conscious of when we're making decisions. I could tell a story about the US-China competition that if we get to 2030, everyone's going to be too old to fight anyway. Right? There's any number of reasons to think that 1900, we had demographic explosions in Europe, where the population had quadrupled in a century, and you didn't know that you could feed everyone. It's a different environment than when
Frank, you can have a robot war.
well, but to what end or why, right? So this is kind of a confused answer to an excellent question. I do think you are right that I would say not just even the process, but the sort of kind of that unspoken assumptions that exist within the decision-making space that we never think to ask, what is shaping how we view the world that we just all take for granted, but someone from 1890 would say, that's weird, or someone from Beijing would say, what are you talking about, right? And so that is another thing that I think gets to this process.
The question of culture as well is very important. We are literally out of time, so
Sorry.
So
I can hang around. And
yeah, so let's continue this offline, so to speak. But we need to close this. Thanks again for making it. I think we had a fantastic discussion, and I look forward to reading your book. It seems that you're broaching questions that I'm thinking about on a daily basis, and cannot, I don't have the answers, but I'm looking forward to reading about your answers.
Excellent.
So thank you very much, and yeah, thanks for coming.
Thanks.